In 1991, a 21-year-old Finnish student posted 9 words on the internet that nobody took seriously. "I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby." 35 years later, that hobby runs more of the internet than Windows ever will. It powers Android, it powers every major cloud server on Earth, and it powers the supercomputers that Microsoft itself rents space on. And the man who built it, he spent decades warning the entire tech industry about exactly what was wrong with the closed-source, forced upgrade model that Microsoft built its empire on. Nobody listened. Until now, because in 2026, millions of Windows users are doing something they swore they'd never do, and the reasons they're giving sound exactly like what Linus Torvalds was saying back when everyone thought he was just a bitter Linux guy with a grudge. Here's why this isn't just tech nostalgia. Microsoft officially ended support for Windows 10 in October 2025. That single decision pushed hundreds of millions of PCs into a choice nobody wanted to make: pay for security updates, buy new hardware for Windows 11, or finally look at the alternative operating system that's been sitting there the whole time. And when people started looking at Linux seriously, not as hobbyists, but as regular users, they found something strange. The criticisms Torvalds made decades ago about closed software, forced obsolescence, and companies controlling what you can do with your own computer, those aren't old arguments anymore. They're literally what's happening to Windows users right now. This isn't a story about one guy being smug. It's a story about an entire philosophy of computing that the industry dismissed and is now scrambling to catch up to. In this video, we're going to break down exactly what Torvalds warned about, why almost nobody in the mainstream tech world took it seriously, what changed between then and now, and why 2026 might be the year his argument finally wins, not because he was trying to destroy Microsoft, but because Microsoft kept proving his point for him. We'll also look at what this means for you, right now. If you're sitting on a Windows machine wondering whether the upgrade pressure is ever going to stop, let's talk numbers, because this is bigger than most people realize. Windows still runs on roughly 7 out of every 10 desktop computers on Earth. That's the scale Microsoft built. But the kernel, Torvalds wrote in his college dorm room, now runs the majority of the world's web servers, nearly all of the top 500 Mac computers, and the Android operating system on billions of phones. Two philosophies. Two completely different bets on how software should work. One was built behind closed doors by a corporation answering to shareholders. The other was built in public, for free, by a community answering to nobody but the code itself. For 30 years, Microsoft's model won the desktop war decisively. But the desktop war isn't the only war anymore, and that's exactly the shift we need to talk about. So what did Torvalds actually say, and why did people brush it off? Back in the 2000s, when Linux was still seen as a hobbyist toy, Torvalds gave interviews where he laid out a simple, consistent critique of how companies like Microsoft operated. One of his most quoted lines was blunt: "Microsoft isn't evil, they just make really crappy operating systems." It wasn't really an insult, it was a diagnosis. His argument wasn't that Microsoft had bad intentions. It was that a closed, profit-driven development model produces worse software than an open, collaborative one, almost by mathematical certainty. He also criticized something that feels eerily familiar today: the practice of forcing people to upgrade hardware and software on a corporate timeline rather than their own. In talks years ago, he argued that an operating system should be completely invisible, not a tool for controlling the user's environment and forcing constant upgrades. Sit with that for a second. That complaint is from over a decade ago, and it describes, almost word for word, what Windows 11's hardware requirements did to millions of perfectly functional PCs in 2025. Now, to be fair, and this matters for understanding the full picture, Torvalds isn't some anti-Microsoft crusader. He's said directly that he doesn't see Windows as competition because the goals of the two systems are different. He's even publicly defended Windows in recent months, pointing out that a lot of the blue screen crashes people blame on bad software are actually caused by unreliable hardware, not Microsoft's code. That's an important, honest detail. Torvalds critiques systems, not people, and he gives credit where it's due. But that's exactly what makes his older warnings so interesting now. He wasn't driven by hatred of Microsoft. He was making a structural argument about what happens when one company controls the operating system millions of people depend on. And structurally, that argument is aging extremely well. Why didn't the industry listen back then? Simple Windows worked well enough. Software compatibility was on Microsoft's side, and switching costs were too high for the average user to even consider it. Linux was seen as something for developers and server rooms, not your grandmother's laptop. That gap is closing fast. Microsoft's official position has always been that Windows upgrades exist for security, performance, and innovation. Windows 11's hardware requirements, they said, were about building a more secure foundation for the future. The reality millions of users are experiencing looks different. Perfectly capable machines, sometimes only 4 or 5 years old, got locked out of the free upgrade path entirely. Telemetry and data collection became harder to fully disable. Features like Copilot got baked deeper into the OS, whether people wanted them or not. And every year, the gap between what Microsoft wants you to do and what you actually want to do with your own computer gets a little wider. This is precisely the dynamic Torvalds was describing decades ago, not as a prediction of doom, but as a structural inevitability. When one company owns the platform and answers primarily to shareholders, user control becomes secondary to product strategy. It's not a conspiracy, it's just incentives. Meanwhile, the open-source alternative has quietly closed the usability gap that used to make Linux a hard sell. Distributions today look and feel familiar to anyone coming from Windows. Software compatibility, while still not perfect, has improved dramatically. And the core promise, you control your machine, not the other way around, remains exactly what it was when Torvalds first wrote it down. So what does this actually mean for you? Practically, if you're a Windows 10 user staring down the end of a support deadline, you genuinely have more options now than at any point in the last 20 years. You don't have to do a dramatic full switch overnight. A lot of people start by dual booting, keeping Windows for the one or two programs they truly need, while running Linux for everything else, and slowly discovering they barely touch the Windows side anymore. If you're someone who's frustrated by forced updates, ads in your start menu, or features you never asked for, that frustration is worth taking seriously rather than just tolerating. The alternative ecosystem has matured enough that it's not the leap of faith it used to be. And if you're simply curious, genuinely, the lowest risk move is trying a Linux distribution from a USB drive without touching your existing Windows install at all. No commitment, no risk, just an honest look at what Torvalds was actually building this whole time. Here's the deeper point underneath all of this. This was never really a story about one operating system beating another. It's a story about two different visions of who technology should serve. One vision says the company that builds the platform gets to decide how you use it, when you upgrade it, and what data it collects along the way. The other vision says the person sitting at the keyboard should have the final say. For 30 years, the first vision had all the momentum, because convenience and compatibility mattered more to most people than ideology. Torvalds never expected to win in some dramatic sense. He said himself he wasn't trying to destroy Microsoft, he was just building something different and letting it speak for itself. What's happening now isn't a takeover. It's a slow, quiet vindication, not because Torvalds fought for it, but because the model he built turned out to be more resilient, more adaptable, and ultimately more respectful of the user than anyone outside the Linux community gave it credit for. Windows 10 support is already gone. The clock on free upgrades, security patches, and compatibility isn't going to reset itself. Every month that passes, more people are quietly making this switch, not because of some dramatic ideological battle, but because the alternative finally caught up to being genuinely usable. The question Torvalds raised decades ago was never really about which operating system is technically superior. It was about who gets to control your computer, you, or the company that sold it to you. That question isn't going away. And in 2026, more people than ever are finally answering it for themselves. If this breakdown opened your eyes to what's actually happening behind the scenes of the Windows Linux shift, subscribe because we're tracking this story as it unfolds, one collapse at a time.